Welcome, everybody. I'm pleased to have a returning guest, Greg, and this time I'm actually recording our first version of a chat, although we decided to talk for 10 minutes before getting started. So it's kind of like we're going to do the same thing as last time, and history repeats itself. But, anyways, Greg, welcome to the release stream. Why don't you give us a little introduction?
Hey, glad to be. No, I'm just kidding. I don't actually talk like that. Yeah, I'm Greg. I go GP Anders is my screen name. Uh,
Which is funny because I always call you G Panders
yeah, I think
in
everyone
my
does,
head.
and that's where like the
Yeah.
now people just call me Panda. So now the Panda has
Oh,
become
man.
my avatar apparently.
That's quite the evolution.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, super happy to be back on the stream. We're gonna be mostly talking about, well, I don't want to give too much away, but I think we're mostly gonna be talking about the file type Lua stuff, which I had a very small part in helping make happen. Um, but yeah, I mean, let's get right to it.
Cool. So to set the stage a little bit, give us how did Vim previous to 0.8 and Vim and NeoVim detect what file type? And by file type, we mean like if it's a Python file or a Rust file or whatever it is. How did Vim or NeoVim do that up until now?
Yeah, so like everything that Vim does, it kind of is a pretty complicated sequence of things. I don't want to use the word mess. Vim is a beautiful
It just
mess,
it
right?
just evolved
Yeah,
over time, right? So like
exactly.
initially that wasn't the thing, and then over
Yeah,
time that happened, and it covers a lot of cases.
it
That's the
does.
other thing too, is like when you want to cover a huge plethora of real world weird edge cases, it turns out things are more
Yep,
complicated than the very
absolutely.
simple version.
Very true. But at a really high level, essentially what happens when you start Vim or NeoVim prior to 0.8 is a file called filetype.vim would be sourced. And this file essentially just created several hundred, actually just shy of 1,000 auto commands. And a particular type of auto command, it would fire on the buff new or buff read, buff file post, I think, uh, and it would trigger off of the file name, and it would use that to infer what type of file you're working with. So at a really trivial example, if your file ends with .py, then it's probably a Python file. If it ends with .c, it's probably a C file. Um, but like we were just talking about, things get complicated, right? Because it turns out in real life there are thousands of different file types, and you can't always assume that a .c file is a C file, right? So over time, Vim started to kind of accrete these different edge cases and um, if checks and things just got more and more complicated. Of course, we also want to handle the case where you don't have a file extension at all, and I should back up and say it's not just file extension, right? So uh, the pattern that it can match the file name on could be anything. It doesn't have to
Mhm.
necessarily be a
Like
file
bash
extension.
RC or so,
Exactly.
or, like something like that. You'd want that to get highlighted like it's
All
bash,
right, or
even though
like
it doesn't
even
have a.
even any, like for example, you could say anything under /etc/profile.d is a shell script,
Mm,
regardless of
right.
regardless if it even has an extension, right? You can do things like
Yep.
that. But of course, you also want to handle the case where there's no extension at all. Imagine the case where you write a shell script, but you want to make it executable, so you don't have an extension, so you can just type dot slash command or whatever, and you use
Hmm.
a like a shebang or something. So in those cases, we can't infer the file type off of the file name. So then we fall back to the file contents, where we check things like the shebang line, and if that's not there, we actually look at the contents of the file and try to infer what's going on. Uh, Now, like of course, because of the huge variety of file types, not and the file type patterns and what makes how do you distinguish between different file types, nobody, not even Bram Moolenaar himself, can do all that himself. So this has been a community effort for a very long time, and it's pretty easy actually to add new file type support to Vim. You just have to make a couple of changes. You send a PR to upstream to Vim, and uh, Bram will usually merge it. He trusts people to that they know what they're doing, and that model has actually worked out pretty well. So
Hmm.
that was where the situation was prior to the discussion of file type.lua. And like I said at the beginning, the way that this is all done is through a series of several hundred auto commands. And it turns out that creating a new auto command isn't slow, but it's not the fastest thing. And when you're doing several hundred of these, close to 1,000 every time you start Vim, there's a non-trivial performance impact there. And at least for me, it was the longest startup item in my startup time.
And there's no way to really turn it off and still have Vim like work
Right. I mean,
basically
you can
in
turn it
any
off.
meaningful
You
way.
could turn it off and not have file type support, but
Right.
in my opinion, that's one of the most useful things of any text editor, nowadays. But especially Vim, which has excellent file type support. So yeah,
Right. And then like beyond that too, like your LSP, which one gets attached is generally speaking based on what files, so it's like it's a feature that sort of everything else is built on top of. So it'd be really weird to just be like, well, I want to make my startup faster, so I'm just going to turn that off. You'd be like, no, that's not like really a viable option.
I guess if you were like a true startup junkie and you wanted to live on the edge, you could disable the built-in file type detection and just like create your own for like the 5 file types that you use. But
right, so like for me, it'd just be like star.rs is Rust,
yeah,
and then like I just need TOML so that I can edit my cargo.toml.
So I guess you
like,
could
that's
do
all
that,
I would.
you still could do that. No one's stopping you from doing
Right.
that now. But
Mm-hmm.
that the next time you open any file that you don't normally use, then you're gonna run into problems. So.
Well, now that we said that though on the internet, I know there's going to be a Reddit post tomorrow about how I sped up file type.lua by 100x.
Yeah. Yeah, almost certainly. Actually, I'll go ahead and say this for any enterprising Redditors thinking of doing that. The very large file type Lua module is packaged inside your precompiled inside your NeoVim binary. So loading it, of course, still takes some time, but it doesn't take a lot of time. So, you're talking about maybe saving yourself, microseconds. So it's probably not worth it.
I'll spend hours. Just saying, no. Okay. So that's the general concept. You've got this going on. There's some other problems that we'll discuss, I think, as well, not just performance wise. For me, I've actually encountered this problem and solved it in effectively the same way, but not upstream. And so it's exciting for me to see this upstreamed, and we'll talk about that as we go. But walk us through how we moved from where we were with sort of these FT detect scripts and some other things like that, and auto commands running and all of this, to where we are today, and then what sort of are we at today?
Sure. Yeah, I think this is actually a really good story because it kind of highlights, it's a good chance to highlight the community involvement of NeoVim as a project. So we just talked about the status quo, where things were, and just to give people a timeline, this is maybe, I don't know, 6 to 8 months ago at this point.
Sounds about right.
And a new plugin kind of made waves in the NeoVim community by a person, GitHub username Nathan Thomas. He created filetype.nvim, and this was a replacement for the built-in filetype.vim file type matching. And the concept of this plugin was that rather than have close to 1,000 auto commands, we have one single auto command that fires once, and then we use the information from the file name or whatever to intelligently figure out the file type. And the performance benefit of this approach was obvious right away. It was much faster than the built-in legacy file type.vim approach. And so obviously it turned a lot of heads and people started paying attention to it, especially, NeoVim, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm a startup time junkie myself. So anything that saves even five milliseconds, I'm not going to ignore that either.
I think we need a shirt. I think we need a T-shirt like Startup Time Junkie with like some like a loading like bar graph. So I'll make a mental note to myself. I got to make that shirt.
I like it. Yeah. So I was using this plugin. I know a couple other people on the core team are using it, and kind of just in our chats, both in our kind of more formal development chats, in our off-topic chats, we're always kind of talking about what will be some cool new features, what we'd like to see. Is there anything we want to upstream? And we're generally fairly conservative about upstreaming features from new plugins. I know some people don't like that's the case, but we
I keep getting asked why isn't Telescope in NeoVim core, and I'm like, we are on different wavelengths.
Right. But this new approach to file type detection seemed like a really good candidate for upstreaming. The but there was a problem with the plugin implementation that I just talked about, and that it really did do everything from scratch. It was total, clean room rewrite, which is obviously, and I'm not faulting the plugin author at all. Doing things your own way is one of the most fun things about programming, and he obviously was doing this for fun, so no fault at all. But
Mm-hmm.
it was not in a state that was acceptable to upstream, because it did regress a lot of file type detection that was working with the old slow legacy stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
we kind of were talking about, okay, what would this look like if we did want to upstream it? We basically had some requirements. We probably would adopt the same design, a single auto command that then dispatches based on whatever information to determine the file type. But we also are going to be very strict that it cannot regress any existing file type detection. Everything that the entire Vim's file type test suite has to pass 100%. And that's a pretty tall order. And it turns out throughout this whole process that by far was the most time consuming thing. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so as far as what was involved with making this change, we knew that putting all this file type detection in a single Lua file was going to get very large, several thousand lines, and that prediction ended up being true. Uh, and at the time, one thing that the one way NeoVim basically packages some of the Lua modules that it ships with. Either some of them are runtime files that you can find and edit right on your disk, but others are actually literally baked into the binary itself. And at the time, they were baked in as source files, and it was actually kind of funny. You could open up the NeoVim binary in like a hex editor and read like raw Lua code. Like the ASCII was there
Yeah.
in the binary. Um,
Mm-hmm.
which meant that every single time you start, this text was not changing, right? Apart from some pathological case where someone was literally editing it in a hex editor, this code was not changing. Um, so it was the rationale was, well, it's not going to change, it's static. So why not pre-compile it? If it's easy to do, if it's not too much of a headache, it's easy to do. Even if it's a modest performance gain, let's go ahead and do it. So that was the very first thing that we did. We added a pre-compilation step into our build pipeline that pre-compiled some of this Lua code into bytecode and put that into the binary. And there were definitely some hiccups at first. Obviously, the Lua JIT bytecode can be architecture specific. So
Mm.
we definitely heard from some packagers in different package manager communities that are having some trouble with this. But we worked with them, and as far as I know, it's been smooth sailing since then. Uh, and then once we had that out of the way, that was kind of a performance bottleneck. Once we had that out of the way, then it was, let's get started on file type Lua. So the first step was trying to just auto generate the structure of our file type.lua design from the existing file type.vim auto commands. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
and thankfully, a lot of the ones that were in there could be parsed automatically. So we just wrote a really simple Lua script that mostly parse like the really simple extension ones, like star.py, star.c, or whatever,
Right.
and did those. That got us probably, I don't know, 50 to 60, I don't know, somewhere around there,
Oh,
percent of the way there.
nice.
So that was a huge amount of leverage, right? That was a big springboard.
Yeah.
And even then, at that point, it was at a state where I was able to start using it full time with very, very few missed file type detections. So
Very cool.
that was great. And actually, that script was super ugly and ad hoc, and gross. But it's still in the repo because just for kind of posterity, we're like, I guess we might as well keep this just in case. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but from there, the big effort was, like I talked about earlier, how do we get this to parity with FileTop.vim? We want the performance without
Mm-hmm.
any regressions. Let's get there, and that was a lot of effort. So here, this is where I want to shout out to the NeoVim community stepped up. I made a post on the NeoVim Reddit saying, hey, here's what we have right now. We're introducing this new file type.lua module, but we need help from the community. Send PRs, any amount you want to do is great. I had envisioned, maybe we'll get a handful of PRs, people saying, oh, I noticed my file type of choice isn't being matched. Here's a
Mm-hmm.
PR to add it. And we'll be like, oh, great, thank you. Um,
Yeah.
but I was very impressed to see that we actually had a couple of contributors come in and really step up and do a lot of heavy lifting. Um, in particular, I want to mention, I'm just going to stick with GitHub usernames because that's all I know. But
That's easy.
yeah, GitHub user SM Jonas and GitHub user Kessie Jones both were big contributors. And SM Jonas in particular, I think had I never counted, but I had to have been at least 6 or 7 PRs, just
Yeah, I
porting.
looked and there were quite a few
Yeah, it's maybe
on
more.
the
Like I said,
commit
I
log.
didn't count.
Yeah,
Just porting a lot of these more complex file type detections from the old Vim script approach to our new Lua approach, and
totally.
they had to endure a lot of ping ponging on design decisions. We flip flopped a lot between should we do it this way, should we do it this way, and they were a champ. So yeah, and like I said, that's just a great example of the native community stepping up and really getting involved. This whole project, this whole thing exists because of people that just love it and want to see it be as good as possible. And I think that's such a very cool thing to be a part of. Um, and then of course I also need to mention another core member who was instrumental in this whole thing, probably even more than me, honestly, and that's GitHub username Clayson. Um, really helped.
Don't worry. I asked Clayson first to come on, but he said no. So
Yeah.
it's okay.
Yeah, that would be great. Maybe one day, but
I'm trying. I'm
yeah.
trying. I'm working on it. I'm working on it.
Clayson like owned it. He saw it through. He managed everything. Management is a very important skill. I don't think people give that enough credit, but being able to herd.
Especially for open source projects,
Totally
because
agree.
it's super easy
Yep.
for things to go off the rails or get sidetracked or end
Yeah.
up in La La Land implementing 5 features when they should have been on the first one. It's just super easy to do, and most people don't do it.
Yep. Yep.
So
I
you
can
totally
I can
agree.
unequivocally, without any hesitation, say that this feature would not be where it is, would not be in 0.8 without Clayson. So give him a shout out next time you see him in Matrix or whatever. But yeah, that's kind of the condensed version of the story. You know, there was a lot of not so fun, kind of just grind it out type of work that had to be done. A lot of, like I said, back and forth over design decisions, trying to meet certain use cases. Um, but it was great. It was really exciting to see this
Mhm.
thing go all the way through to the finish line. Seeing from where we started all the way through to being shipped as the new default is pretty cool.
Yeah, and so now in 08, not only is it there, but it is the default way that file type detection happens. And I just want to mention the 2 ways that you can sort of consume this, and I'll probably show some stuff live on Twitch about this. But the first one is that you can add new file type detection using the same mechanism, which is cool. I think that that's nice because then everyone is sort of like, if you want to add detection for your like custom language or whatever, you're doing that all in the same place, and it plays nice with other people's priority settings and all this other stuff going on in file type. Anything interesting that you want to call out sort of about that way that you can easily add and register new file types?
One thing that I personally use, so one thing that's always kind of annoyed me is I do a lot of work in C, and
Mm-hmm.
the by default Vim treats .h files as C++ headers, not C headers,
Mm-hmm.
which
Mm-hmm.
has some kind of annoying side effects. So you could, of course, just override that and say .h files are C headers, but then anytime you work with C++, you're gonna have the opposite problem. So
Right.
one thing that, and I actually,
Well, among many others, right? I
right,
mean,
yeah. So one thing that I did, what I thought was kind of cool, a use case of this was, the file type add function lets you specify functions for an extension. So you can say anytime you run across this extension, run this
mm-hmm.
function to determine what file type I'm working with. And so I used a very loose heuristic. Basically, it said if any of the includes in the first 100 lines don't have the .h suffix, then assume it's a C++ file. Otherwise, assume it's a C file. And
Nice.
of course, this does fail sometimes, but it also works most of the time.
And it works for you,
And it works
which
for
is the cool. That's the part that
exactly.
I think is cool. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So most of the time now, it it detects correctly, um, and of course I want to be clear. You could definitely do that in the old way too. But
Right.
the new method, you being able to use Lua functions, simple callbacks is just much cleaner and just a lot more pleasant to work with. So
Yeah, and I think also it can, if I understand correctly, file type comes with its own sort of like priority
mhm.
stuff built inside. And that was one of the things that always felt really lacking in the previous version, because it's like last one wins, right? Like, oh, I'm running this, and like I have some plugin I installed happened to register this thing later, and it like works with C stuff, and so it's good that I have it, but it's like, and that's kind of annoying, because it can just end up getting into a situation where you're not doing that, as opposed to like this situation. I think it's much nicer where we sort of built this for people to be able to work together nicely.
Yeah, the priority in the file type.vim scheme was implicit based on the order of the auto commands, and so it was very difficult to keep track of who really does have higher priority. And it was you never really could know if the order of the auto commands was intentional to enforce a priority or totally arbitrary, right? Like you couldn't know that because it wasn't ever specified. So having the priority be explicit, I think, is a much better approach.
Yeah. So that's the first side, this ability to do like vim.filetype.add. Very cool. I like that. The second side that I think is cool is before file type detection basically ran as like a side effect, right? You like ran this function. It was unclear what happened, but when you were done, a file type was set. Like, okay, that's nice, I guess. But like sometimes you want to know ahead of time what file type something is going to be. For me, I actually ran into this problem, ended up making a very similar solution. I guess Clayson probably was familiar with the solution, so maybe there is some inspiration, because I do notice some of the same things in the core one. I made one in Plenary that did very similar stuff, because I needed to be able to tell Telescope what type of buffer something was going to be without actually running arbitrary auto commands on a bunch of text, which could end up having me do like a lot of stuff that I didn't want, like start an LSP or something. I was like, I don't want to start LSPs in a preview window. I just want to highlight some code with the right language. And so I ended up making one that like did that very similarly. So for me, that part of it is very exciting. And I think it's another thing that like NeoVim has been doing well, is like, something's going to have a side effect, like setting the file type. That's a side effect. But if we can make that like side effect become the result of some function that you can get the result of, that's like much better, both in terms of like understanding what's happening, as well as being like someone who wants to do random stuff not initially thought about for file types, which is me, right? So it's like better for plugin authors too. So I really love that part of the feature. And I just wanted to say that because I like it, and I get to delete some code that I wrote before, which is great. I'm excited to delete that. Or I'll probably just basically have it call vim.filetype for a while and then delete it later, which will be nice. So that's cool.
Yeah, the side effect thing is interesting. It doesn't, because a lot of them not only set the file type of the buffer, which you're right is a side effect, but also set buffer variables and sometimes even global variables. So it's just side effects everywhere. So dealing with that was a pretty interesting design challenge, but I think we came up with something that works pretty well.
Yeah, and I'm pretty excited for it. I also, like you were saying, I think it's just another fun sort of story, and it's nice to be able to give a shout out to all the people who did a lot of great work, including you, Greg, including you. Getting this feature to shipping and the default. And I bet everyone who installed 0.8 and didn't read the release notes had literally zero idea that this happened, except maybe if they check their startup time logs, be like, oh, that's faster. So that's like a really awesome thing, and it just like feels so good when you like silently ship some feature that's better but keeps everything working the same. That's super exciting.
I agree 100%.
Cool. Any closing thoughts, any shout outs, Greg? Any self promo that you need to do?
No self promo. No, I think I just want to say, I love being a part of this community. It's super fun. I, no doubt in my mind that this tool will be around for a very long time. The faces will change, a lot of things about it will change, but I think the underlying spirit of it will persist for a long time to come. So it's a really exciting thing to be a part of, and I just am really happy to have been a part of it.
Thanks, Greg Panda, and we will see you next release, I'm sure.
Okay.
See you later.
All right, see you later, TJ.